Um, Welcome to the webinar. The presentation will last around 35 minutes, and there will be ample time at the end for your questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A box. If you have a question that needs immediate attention, you can raise your hand, but that's only in case of emergency. We're here to talk about the latest report from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEEFA, titled Carbon Captured's Methane Problem. It takes a closer look at Enchant Energy's plan for the coal plant at San Juan, New Mexico. Proponents say it will sequester emissions at capacity rates of 90% or more, and our authors beg to differ. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. David Schlissel is Director of Resource Planning Analysis at IEEFA. He has been a regulatory attorney and consultant on energy and utility issues since 1974. He has testified as an expert witness before regulatory commissions in more than 35 states and before the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commissions. David has consulted for utilities, state governments and attorneys general, consumer advocates, city governments, and national and local environmental organizations. He has engineering degrees from MIT and Stanford, as well as a Juris Doctor from Stanford School of Law. David will be doing today's presentation. He's joined by Dennis Wamsted, who will be available at the end for your questions. Dennis is an IEEFA analyst and editor who has covered energy and environmental policy and technology issues for 30 years. He is the former editor of the Energy Daily, a Washington, D.C. based newsletter, and is a graduate of Harvard University. So without further ado, David, please begin.
Good day, everyone. Morning for some, afternoon for others. Today, I'm going to walk you through the results of our new analysis and the methodology that we use to develop these results. But first, I have a couple of points I'd like to share to give it context. First, there's been a debate for years about how effectively carbon capture technology will capture the carbon dioxide produced at fossil-fired generators. Initially, proponents said that carbon capture would be capture 90% of the CO2 produced. That number has crept up over the last year or two to 95%, and I've actually seen a proposal with a 97% claim. Based on the actual operating experience at the two commercial scale power plants that actually captured CO2, we disagree. We don't think that the technology has been proven. We believe it is still an immature technology. Expanding our analysis to look at life cycle emissions is a natural outgrowth of the work that Dennis and I have done over the last few years. Let me now start us through the slides. Our first, this slide is our overall result. The industry claims in general that 95% of CO2 from a fossil-fired generator will be captured. However, that just focuses on the generator itself. It does not look at any upstream or any downstream emissions related to the operation of the power plant. If you include just the methane emissions from the mine that supplies the coal for San Juan generating station, which we're focusing on in this analysis, only 72% of the emissions from both the plant and the mine would be captured. And that's at a 95% capture rate for the plant itself. If a more realistic 80% capture rate was used, then the overall capture rate for both mine and power plant would be just 61% of the CO2 that's produced. Earlier this, I guess in July now, Back in July, the DOE announced its intention to evaluate proposed applications for funding carbon capture projects to look at life cycle analyses. We're really happy to hear this because it is very important to include both upstream and downstream emissions. The DOE also says that projects must achieve a minimum unit-wide carbon dioxide capture rate of 95% once stable operations are achieved, and the quotes are from the DOE's notice of intent. We believe that no plant will be able to show that, no project will be able to show that from a life cycle point of view, they will be capturing 95% of their emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions. Again, why is it important to consider full life cycle, emissions? On the one hand, you have the upstream effect, methane released during the coal mining. Then you have the power plant producing and capturing CO2. And then there are downstream effects, possible leakage from CO2 pipelines, potential emissions from the burning or use as a petrochemical feedstock of additional oil that would be produced when the captured CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery. And finally, leakage from the CO2 underground storage facility. This will be the last time I mention this, but proponents and the US Congress in their tax credit proposals, including the new bill, focus on just the power plant segment, the area inside the red box on this slide. We've looked, in order to do this analysis, we've looked at 5 key questions. How much methane, looking at this in CO2 equivalents, does the San Juan mine produce? An historical view. How much methane would be emitted by the mine if the power plant were retrofitted for carbon capture? How much CO2 would the plant produce if retrofitted for carbon capture? What's an appropriate range of carbon capture rates to assume for a retrofitted San Juan generating station? And are there other possible circumstances that we've not addressed that could lead to even lower capture rates than we're showing in this study? Why did we focus on San Juan generating station? 3 reasons. First and foremost, there is publicly available data on the emissions, the CO2 equivalent emissions from both the mine and from San Juan generating station. Second, Enchant has acknowledged there's very limited investor interest in their project. Consequently, it will be seeking almost $1 billion in funding from the federal government. And third, all but one of the San Juan generating station's current owners have decided that the plant is no longer economical to operate and should be retired this year. In fact, at the end of June, they retired San Juan Unit 1. The remaining unit is Unit 4, which I believe is currently scheduled to be retired at the end of September. These are the results of our analyses. We actually looked at 2 sets of capacity factors, as I'll explain in a moment. The first set was at 85% because that's what Enchant is claiming the plant will operate at after it is retrofitted for carbon capture. If you assume a 95% capture rate, the overall for the plant, the overall capture rate for both mine and plant would be 72%. If you assume an 80% capture rate for the plant, then the overall rate for both mine and plant would be only 61%. And if you assumed a 65% capture rate for the power plant, which we don't think is a worst case by any stretch of the imagination, the combined capture rate for plant and mine would be only 49%. That's on the left side of this slide. On the right side, in the brownish color, you can see the bars show how much CO2 equivalents would be captured, or CO2 actually, since it would all come from the power plant. In the orange-ish bars show how much CO2 equivalent CO2 equivalent would be continued to be emitted, because as we understand it, there's no plan to capture the methane from the mine. And you can see that substantial amount of CO2 would continue to be emitted. How much methane has the San Juan plant emitted? This chart on the right shows you in millions of tons of CO2 equivalent. The key drop from 2017 to 2018 reflects that 2 of the 4 units at San Juan, units 2 and 3, were retired at the end of 2017. So there was less need for coal from the mine. So the coal mined less coal was mined. In converting from tons of methane emitted to tons of CO2 equivalent, we've used a global warming potential of 84, which is considered the short-term global warming potential, because climate tipping points not addressed in the short term will result in difficult to reverse environmental damage that will make long-term problems worse. What we're seeing in the heat waves around the world this summer, in the multi-decade drought in the West, in the fires, are causing not only short-term, but also long-term damage. That's why it's important to look at the impact of continued operation of San Juan, even with carbon capture equipment on the power plant in the short term. It's also important to remember that the actual methane emissions from the mine may be significantly higher than reported. The International Energy Agency has put out a study that says, if I recall correctly, the actual methane emissions around the world are probably 70% higher than governments have reported. This chart shows the annual coal production. The brown bar is annual coal production. The orange bar is the annual methane emissions. And then the dashed line is the methane emissions per ton of coal produced. You can see that starting after 2017, when 2 of the 4 units at San Juan were retired, the methane emissions per ton of coal mined increased, first to 103, then to 0.5, dropped to 0.5. And the last year for which data is available, it was 0.73. In this analysis, we've used a 0.69 tons of methane emitted in CO2 equivalents per ton of coal produced. This chart shows you the bottom part, the darker brown, shows the CO2 emissions from the power plant, and the top, or units 1 and 4, excuse me. And the top part are the CO2 equivalent emissions from the mine. So ignoring the mine emissions is not ignoring a small matter. the mine emissions in CO2 equivalents are significant and need to be considered, not only at San Juan, but for each coal plant that is being proposed for retrofitting for carbon capture, at natural gas-fired plants, and also at blue hydrogen projects. So what we're saying today, the numbers would change and some of the description would change, but the method, the analysis applies to other fossil projects. How much methane would the mine emit if the plant were retrofitted for carbon capture? Depends on how much coal is needed by the plant. This in turn depends on how much the plant is operated. On average, San Juan units 1 and 4 have burned slightly over half a ton of coal per megawatt hour that they generate. We'll come back to this and you'll see why it's important. The dashed line shows you how much coal has been burned per megawatt hour by units 1 and 4 since 2012, each year since 2012. And for the power plant, emissions and coal amount of coal burned and generation are available through 2021, unlike the data for the mine, which only goes through 2020 so far. Enchant Energy assumes, as do pretty much all the proponents of carbon capture, that after being retrofitted, their project, in this case, San Juan Generating Station, will operate at an annual 85% capacity factor. Capacity factor compares the plant's actual generation in a year, which what it hypothetically would have produced if it had generated 100% power for every hour of the year. It's presented as a percentage. The higher the percentage, the more electricity is generated by the power plant. You can see here a couple of things. First, units 1 and 4 at San Juan, the units that Enchant intends to retrofit for carbon capture, have not achieved an 85% capacity factor since 2009. Second, in the last 4 years for which there is complete data, the average capacity factor for the units was only 64%. Third, and I find this really interesting, remember I said that units 2 and 3 at San Juan were retired at the end of 2017. When those units were retired, you might have expected that the generation of the 2 remaining units, units 1 and 4, would go up. In reality, they didn't. And I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. Finally, at the end of 2019, the large Navajo Generating Station, which was a neighbor of San Juan Generating Station, the 2,200 megawatt Navajo NGS was retired, but again, it didn't increase the generation at San Juan. There are at least 3 reasons why we believe it's unlikely that the generation from SJGS is going to go up after the plant, if the plant were retrofitted for carbon capture. First is, excuse me, I went the wrong way. The power plant is already a high cost generator, averaging almost $45 per megawatt hour since units 2 were retired at the end of 2017. And this doesn't reflect the higher costs, the higher heat rates, and the additional internal plant loads that will be experienced if the power plant were retrofitted for carbon capture. Second reason why we don't expect the output of San Juan Generating Station to go up if it were retrofitted for carbon capture is the increasing competition from declining cost renewable resources and battery storage capacity. And finally, the age of the units. They're already 45 and 40 years old, respectively. Further aging can be expected to lead to declining operating performance, and increasing costs. Here are two charts to show you the development of renewables in the western portion of the United States. You can see that on the left, first wind, then wind and solar, and now wind and solar and battery storage are skyrocketing, or have skyrocketed. In the chart on the right is taken from a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab analysis of the capacity that is in the interconnection queues of utilities in the West and the California Independent System Operator. It comes to, as of the end of 2021, excuse me, it totaled 390,000 megawatts of proposed capacity. Renewable capacity was in the queue, which mean that there were proposals for projects. 100, you can see here, almost 38,000 standalone solar. That just means a solar project, no storage. 53,000 megawatts of standalone wind. 105,000 megawatts of new standalone storage. 181,000 megawatts of storage paired with either solar or wind. And finally, 13,400 megawatts of new hybrid resources, which means resources that combined two or more generating options or storage options. For example, there are some of the proposals include a wind and storage, using both wind and storage at the same site. If only 20% of this 390,000 megawatts that was in the were in the interconnection queues at the end of 2021 is ultimately built, we don't expect that all will be built. If only 20% is built, the installed capacity in the West will double, and that will mean more competition for San Juan. This chart, number 16, shows what we project the plants will generate. Again, the blue bar was at a low 65% capacity factor, which reflects units 1 and 4's recent operating performance, and the, I don't know, light brownish orange bars represent Enchant Energy's claimed 85% capacity factor. These numbers are derived from calculations that reflect what I mentioned before, that San Juan Generating Station burns approximately 0.53 tons of coal per megawatt hour it generates, and that the San Juan mine emits roughly 0.69 tons of methane and CO2 equivalents per ton of coal produced. How much CO2 would San Juan produce if it's retrofitted for carbon capture? Historically, you can see here the blue line of the annual tons of CO2 emitted by San Juan by units 1 and 4, excuse me, each year since 2012. The bottom line shows the annual gross generation at the facility. The dashed line shows how many tons of CO2 are emitted per ton per megawatt, excuse me, per gross ton, excuse me, per megawatt hour generated by the units. The dash divides the two simply. So you get annual tons of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour of gross generation. It has slowly gone up over the years. In this analysis, we don't assume any further growth increase in the tons of CO2 emitted by the plant per megawatt hour of gross generation. We use a figure of 1.16 tons of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour, which is the average of the years 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. What's an appropriate range of carbon capture rates to assume for retrofitted San Juan generating station? As I mentioned, advocates, including Enchant, claim if retrofitted, the power plant would capture 90% or more of the CO2 they produce. We disagree. We think the range is probably more like 65 to 80% per year. Nevertheless, our analysis assumes that San Juan's future capture rate would range between 65% and 95%, with the high end reflecting Enchant's claim about the future performance of the carbon capture facility. Obviously, the effective carbon capture rates that we show for both the plant and the mine would be even lower if we assumed that San Juan generating station would capture less than 65% of the CO2 it produces. There are other potential circumstances would lead to even lower carbon capture rates, life cycle carbon capture rates, excuse me. In addition to the scenarios that we've examined in this study, leaks in the equipment used to compress the captured CO2 before it is piped to the geological storage site or the site where it would be used for enhanced oil recovery, leak in the pipelines that would transport the captured CO2 from the plant to either site, leaks at the underground storage site, and any additional CO2 that is produced, or methane that is produced when the captured CO2 is used either for enhanced oil recovery. That is used, if any or all the captured CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery, and then the oil is either burned or used as a petrochemical feedstock. Here again, we're back at the results. This is the same slide. I don't have any further comments on these slides, but just wanted to bring them back to your attention. If you look in our report, you'll see the carbon capture, the effective carbon capture rates for the 65% capacity factor cases we looked at. But I've tried to simplify it here and just use the 85% capacity factor and the 85% capacity factor that Enchant claims they will achieve. And now ready for questions.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Susan Torres, can you see if there are any questions?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think a couple are coming in. One is, I'll just read this one out loud, and then I saw that somebody had their hand raised. But again, if you have a question, there's the question, the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So this question says, thank you for helping with the understanding of life cycle analysis. It's prompted some interesting challenges that need to be overcome, but I don't believe the project should be abandoned. You should recommend measure to capture the CH4 at the mine. Also, renewable power may appear cheap on a wholesale basis, which is good for business, but the end user customer does not feel these benefits. There's an example from German households paying some of the highest prices in Europe, and recommendations to improve the project performance would be constructive. I don't know, David, if you have any response on that one.
Well, it'd be nice to see them come up with a proposal to capture the methane, if they intend to go ahead. But the plant still has two problems. Well, the three problems I mentioned. One is that the units are old. Two is the plant has been an expensive generator of power, and the cost of producing power can be expected to go up because of the retrofitting for carbon capture. What happens is if you retrofit a coal plant or a gas-fired plant for carbon capture, some of the power that would otherwise be sold to the community or to in potential power purchase agreements, or from this end, power sale agreements, is consumed by the carbon capture equipment. So the net power output is lower, and the cost per megawatt hour of producing power is spread over fewer units of net output. So the cost is going to go up that way. So the power is going to be, the price of power is going to be expensive. And the 4 units at San Juan have not been known for their reliability. In fact, they've been very unreliable at times. So I don't see an optimistic case for the plant competing with declining cost renewables. And the idea about end use, and San Juan generating station, if retrofitted for carbon capture, will be competing in the wholesale markets. They'll be competing against other wholesale resources, including, as I've shown, renewables and battery storage. And we believe that right now renewable resources are cheaper, and we expect that, and others expect, that starting again next year, that the cost of renewables will decline further. So I guess I disagree with the various aspects of the question, but I'm sorry, I don't know anything about end-use electric rates in Germany. I know that they have burned coal until recently. They're still burning coal. They burn natural gas, they burn renewables, and they burn nuclear. And the cost to the end use consumer is a mix of all those resources. But that's about all I know.
But if I could hop in there and just add one quick
Sure.
comment, David. We would, I think, be confident or willing to say that without all the renewables in Germany, it's very likely that end-use prices would be even higher than they are now, especially with the increase in natural gas prices over the past 18 months. We're quite confident that renewables help keep prices overall lower than they would have been. So if you take renewables out of the system, you are going to be raising the price overall. We haven't done any specific analysis on Germany lately, but I think that assumption of ours would hold true in Germany as well as it does in the US.
Absolutely. Next, Susan.
Great, thanks. The next question comes from Mark Trahant. I'm sorry if I'm getting anyone's names pronounced incorrectly. Mark asks, is there a way to calculate the costs adding in the subsidy from the proposed Inflation Reduction Act?
Actually, there is. If you go to our report and look at figure 11, I calculated how much Enchant would get each year in federal tax credits, although they get federal tax credits under the current tax provisions, the 45Q that's in existence today. And then I also included what the payments would be, because under the old Build Back Better bill, unfortunately, we finished this study before the Senate came up with the new IRA proposal, but I believe that the provisions for carbon capture subsidies are similar. It'd be hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
Here, look at the case in front of us. If let's say that the emissions that's in the 95% capture rate, Enchant would get hundreds of millions of dollars. I believe the number is somewhere $400 or $500 million a year, because they've captured a fair amount of CO2, but they'd also be emitting nearly 3 million tons a year, which is not insignificant. And if the carbon capture rate, the actual performance of the carbon capture facility is not 95%, but is lower, Enchant would still be getting hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the federal tax government, from taxpayers, us, even though it's emitting 4 million tons of CO2 a year or more. So yes, there would continue to be significant subsidies, because the subsidies are focused just on how much is captured by the power plants at the power plant level. Excuse me. Next.
And wait, one quick immediate add-on to that would be, it would be hundreds of millions of dollars a year in subsidies if they were capturing that carbon. We would argue that closing down the coal plant makes much more sense, and using those hundreds of millions of dollars to build new renewables and battery storage. There is obviously a limited amount of money. It's an opportunity cost. We shouldn't be using it to fund the retrofitting of old carbon based resources. We should be using that money to build new renewables.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question from Trey Cowan. Is there an assessment of how much of the project is based on 45Q tax credits to fund the project?
The 45Q, or what, as I understand 45Q in the proposed bill, which I've only had a limited chance to look at it, it's in addition to funding that the DOE would give out to build the carbon capture facility. The DOE subsidies to add the carbon capture would be are in addition to the 45Q benefits that the owner would receive. The recent DOE notice of intent said that they expected applicants to bear 50% of the cost of construction, or some words to that effect. So for a project like this one, which will probably cost $1.5 billion to $2 billion ultimately, it would be $1 billion, as much as $1 billion of additional federal subsidy on top of the ones I just discussed.
Great.
Okay, that's it on that.
Thanks. Next up, we have Matthew McQueen. Do you have any data on leakage from long-term storage?
No, I mean, there's some data, I believe, on the storage in Norway, but generally, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me. If they want to contact me, I can look it up. I mean, there's concern about leakage from an underground storage facility. and leakage from the use of captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and leakage from CO2 pipelines. So it's a concern.
Thanks, David. Maybe if you want to go to our contact slide so we can have that up for people if this is spurring any further questions that they have. Great. And we'll go to the next question. Thomas, this one is from Thomas Solomon. What effect will closing the San Juan generating station have upon methane emissions? For example, how much will it continue to leak even if they stop mining coal?
I'm sure that it would leak some. I don't have an analysis of how much would continue to leak. Something would have to be done to clean it up. And I would hope that the owners of the plant would be held to account for cleaning it up. So to reduce the methane emissions post-operation to the maximum extent possible.
Great, thanks, David. Next question comes from Alan Ramo. This facility with carbon capture appears to be economically not feasible and still pollutes. Can you elaborate at all? What Alan's asking, what's he missing here?
If I understand it, somebody Enchant wants money from the federal government to run an uneconomic power plant, and they hope that they'll get that money and make a profit off it without bearing any of the risk or much of the risk.
Alan, I think we would say that you have hit the nail on the head. You're not missing anything. This is not an economic plant, and carbon capture does not make economic sense on coal-fired power plants.
Great, there you have it. Next up is Michelle Irwin. Are the current standards enough to stop projects like this, or does something else need to happen?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that what the DOE needs to decide to stop projects like this one is to look at the economics, look at the life and look at the life cycle emissions. You know, the question of that we didn't address because we wanted to keep this analysis clean is what happens if you use a significant portion of the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. There are some analyses show that you reduce the benefit of, basically you lose roughly 40 to 60% of the captured CO2 because, as I mentioned before, the additional oil that's produced is either burned or used as a petrochemical feedstock. So you can see that if Enchant wanted to make money by selling the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, this slide would be the slide on the right here would be totally different, because then you'd have the additional emissions from the burning or other use of the oil that's produced through EOR. So I don't know about standards. I don't know if they mean air standards or whatever. I think it's really an economic question, and it's the question that Dennis just raised, which is, do you spend money on technology on a plant that's going to have a limited lifetime, or are you better spending money on renewables and battery storage, which can give you decades of benefits? We believe the answer is clear. That's
Great. Thank you, David. Just to remind everyone, we have another question. This is being recorded and we will add this to our website in the next day or so, and we can send it out to the attendees too, if that's helpful. So we will get the recording out to everyone. Okay, next question is from Tom Singer. And I'm going to try to mash these up because he sent a clarification. So I hope I get this right. Coal mine methane emissions are not a regulated pollutant. Do we have any leverage to get Enchant to capture this methane and pipe it for end use, generate electric power with it at the site, or at least flare it to convert the methane to CO2? Let me know if you want me to read that again.
The only leverage I think we have is if the DOE says you can't do this project unless you do the three things that Tom mentions. Capture it, use it to produce electricity at the site. I forget what the third was, but that's basically the leverage is by the DOE requiring any applicant to do that. You know, I should mention that some of the proposed carbon capture projects are for coal plants that get their coal from surface mines. There's no way to capture that methane. I mean, they don't even record it. So we don't know how much they emit, and there's no way to capture it. So those projects should be dead on arrival at the DOE. I hope they will be.
I might add, I'm not sure, Tom, that we have a whole lot of leverage, but there is the financial angle, and DOE is not going to fund all of this project or any other carbon capture project. And the more information we can bring to bear to the folks who might want to finance such a project, the better chance we'll have of stopping it. This is not, shouldn't be financeable. It's not a good long-term option. There are better ways to invest your dollars if you're a bank or a private equity firm or some billionaire that wants to fund a development. There are better, faster, quicker ways to improve the air quality and generate clean energy.
Great, thanks. The third one was flaring, and I don't know if there's anything you want to add about that to your answer.
Well, flaring produces CO2, which is less of, well, but it's less than methane.
Right.
So I guess it's a benefit because there's something worse.
Sort of goes back to my original point that we're trying to put lipstick on this pig and make it look attractive, and it just ain't gonna be.
Great. Next up, we have a question from Charles Goodmacher. So for the benefit of the group, David Schlissel will be presenting next Tuesday, August 9th, in front of the New Mexico Economic Development and Policy Committee. And you can watch that live. It'll be virtual. We can put that in the chat as well. And Charles is wondering if some of this will also be included in that presentation coming up on Tuesday.
The answer is yes. That was easy.
That was the easiest one so far. Great. And Jamie, I don't have the ability to send anything to the entire chat, but if you could just, I'll send you the link and we can put that in for everyone's reference. Okay, moving right along. We have another question from Tom Singer. Do state climate rules governing electric utility greenhouse gas emissions include mine methane emissions in their calculations, and which would further limit the marketability of Enchant power?
I'm embarrassed to admit, but I don't know the answer to that. I would hope they do, but I don't know the answer to that. I should, but I don't.
Unfortunately, I agree. I don't know the answer either. I will have to pass and get back to you on that one.
Okay. Mark these done. Next question from Dinah Razor. I'm sorry again if I'm getting any of these wrong. Have you factored in the cost and pollution of the CO2 pipelines that would need to be built?
No, we have just focused on the mine and the power plant here. In the future, I think that we will look at other aspects of the life cycle of proposed carbon capture projects. But for this one, we just wanted it simple and clean to look at the mine and the power plant where we had data.
And if we had included it, it would have raised the cost and worsened the environmental performance. So,
And lowered the capture rate.
yeah. So,
Yeah, we know that. So we were trying to give a best case kind of. If you included any of the leakage that we had in the downstream emissions, it would just make the case worse for the project. So in a way, we've made it look better.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions and we have a little bit more time. So if you have other questions, please add them in. Next question is from Karen Faradun. Karen says, I live in Pennsylvania. We have hundreds of thousands of orphaned and abandoned natural gas wells that are leaking now and will continue to leak in perpetuity. Do you have any plans to look at natural gas in future research?
Yes. What we would like to do is to look at a proposal to add carbon capture to a natural gas-fired power plant, and then to look at do a similar life cycle analysis for a blue hydrogen project.
Great, sorry, I had a hard time finding my mute button. Yeah, and if you look around our website too, we have all kinds of research on additional energy projects, so look in there as well. Last question that we have in the queue at the moment. Karen says, hurry up, David, from that project. Next question that we have is Saraswati Khalsa. Is there any alternate plan to use the plant for renewable energy? Many older plants are a great site for that because they're already connected to transmission lines.
There are plans to use some of the transmission for renewables. So I guess it's a yes. I believe the answer is yes.
yes, and I believe that is one of the holdups that has stopped the conclusion of a deal between Enchant and Farmington and the owner at PNM. PNM wants to retain control of the transmission assets, and without any of the transmission assets, Enchant and Farmington won't be able to sell the power from the retrofitted coal plant. So I think those transmission assets are very valuable, and PNM wants to hold on to them.
Okay, and we just got another question, kind of a follow-up. Do you think the Department of Energy will decide not to fund this, or any crystal ball predictions on what do you think the DOE will do with this project?
I don't know. I'm hoping they don't fund it. I would rather see transition money go to the Navajo community and the broader community in northwestern New Mexico to help them get over the coal plant, get through the transition away from it. We'll see. I believe there's going to be a lot of politics involved in which projects get funded and which don't. So we'll just see. as Dennis said before, I mean, all we can do is present information out to people like this and hope it changes some minds about what projects to fund and how to spend that money, the money that we do have.
Yeah, theoretically, in last year's infrastructure bill, there was money included for the funding of 2 coal-fired power plant carbon capture projects. I would hope that DOE would pick the best available proposals out there to fund, and I don't believe that Enchant is the best available project to fund.
Great. Well, we have no more questions in the Q&A portal right now. I don't see any other chats, and we're right at an hour, so perfect timing. Thank you, David and Dennis, for presenting this information, and thank you to everyone who attended for your thoughtful questions. Once again, we will have this on the website in the next few hours, or today or tomorrow. So take a look at that on our website when it's up. And if you think of any additional questions, we're always happy to answer any questions or provide additional information. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Take care.